Nobody stays outside in this storm. That was all Walter Hayes said, 71 years old, 14 days from losing everything. Standing at the door of a garage the bank was about to take, and 12 strangers on motorcycles were staring at him through the rain like he was their last hope on earth. He had every reason to say no. He said yes anyway. And that single decision made in 30 seconds in the middle of the night, during the worst storm in 40 years, was about to change his life in ways he never could have imagined. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The eviction notice had been sitting in his jacket pocket for 11 days. Walter Hayes knew the exact weight of it. He didn't need to touch it to feel it. It was there every morning when he put the jacket on, and it was there every night when he hung it back on the hook by the door. 11 days of carrying that paper around like a stone pressed against his ribs. He never took it out. He never read it again after the first time. Once was enough. The words didn't change no matter how many times you looked at them. 14 days, that was what the bank had given him. 14 days to come up with back payments he didn't have, or surrender the building he had poured 38 years of his life into. And now, with 11 of those days already burned through, Walter was standing at his workbench at 10:30 at night, wiping down a wrench he had owned since 1987, and asking himself a question he had been avoiding for weeks. "What are you still doing here, old man?" He didn't have a good answer. He never did when he asked it honestly. The work had dried up years ago. The town of Red Hollow, Montana had changed around him the way towns do, slowly, then all at once. The young people left. The new people who came didn't bring motorcycles. They brought laptops and opinions about coffee. His old customers had either moved away, traded their bikes for sensible sedans, or passed on. His waiting list, which had once stretched 6 weeks out, had been empty for going on 2 years. By every measure that made sense on paper, Walter Hayes should have locked that door and walked away a long time ago. But here was the thing about the garage that nobody else understood. Evelyn was still here. Well, not in any way he could explain to another person without sounding like a man who had lost his grip. He knew that. He wasn't crazy, and he wasn't the kind of man who confused grief with haunting. But 31 years of marriage leaves marks on a place. The coffee machine in the corner, the old one, the rattling one that made too much noise and never got the temperature quite right. Evelyn had bought that for him in 1994 because she said he needed something warm to drink at night when he worked late. He had replaced the filter housing twice. The machine still worked. He was never getting rid of it. The photographs on the east wall, those were hers too in a way. She had been the one who suggested he start keeping them pictures of customers with their bikes going back to 1986. Walter, she had told him, "You're not just fixing machines, you're giving people back something they love. You should remember that." So he had started taking the pictures and she had helped him hang them, and now there were over 200 of them covering that wall from floor to ceiling. Faces he recognized, a few he had forgotten, all of them connected to a moment in this building when something broken became whole again. And then there was Ryan, his son, 26 years old when he died. A motorcycle accident on a highway in Colorado on a cross-country ride he had been planning since he was 16. Walter had helped him rebuild the bike himself, a 1978 Triumph Bonneville that Ryan had found in a junkyard and fallen in love with. They had spent 2 years on that machine together in this exact garage at this exact workbench. The last photograph Walter had of his son was taken right here, Ryan grinning next to the finished Bonneville helmet under his arm 3 days before he left. The photograph was on the wall with all the others. Walter couldn't leave. He knew it wasn't rational. He knew Evelyn would have told him in that gentle and immovable way she had that a building is just a building and she was not inside the walls. He knew Ryan would have laughed at him and said, "Pop, come on, let it go." He knew all of that. He still couldn't do it. So he stood at his workbench at 10:47 on a Thursday night in October, wiping down a wrench while the storm outside went from bad to catastrophic, and he waited for a reason that never needed to come, because he was already home. This was it, and in 14 days someone else was going to own it. He heard the thunder first. Then the rain hit the roof like something alive and furious. Not the ordinary sound of a Montana rainstorm, but something bigger. Something that made the lights flicker and the windows rattle in their frames. Walter looked up from his workbench. The wind was doing something outside that he hadn't heard since the winter of 2009, when a storm had taken out a quarter-mile of fencing on the McCaffrey Ranch and put a tree through the elementary school gymnasium. He set down the wrench and walked to the door. He opened it 6 inches, and immediately the rain came through sideways, cold enough to cut, hard enough to sting. Visibility on the highway was maybe 50 feet. The road out front, the state highway that connected Red Hollow to the rest of the world, was running with water at the edges, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of a drainage ditch that was overwhelmed and going over its bank. Walter closed the door. "All right," he said to nobody. He went back to the workbench and picked up the wrench again. Whatever was happening out there was nothing he could do about it. He'd survived 63 Montana winters. He knew how to wait them out. He was reaching for the second wrench when he heard it. An engine, then another, then more, a whole collection of engines all at once, revving and struggling against the weather, getting closer fast. Walter put the wrench down slowly. He walked back to the door. He opened it. And through the rain, through the dark, through the worst night in 40 years of northern Montana weather, 12 headlights came toward him down the highway. They weren't driving fast. They were barely moving. They were weaving slightly in the wind, leaning into it, fighting for every 100 yards. Whoever these riders were, they had been out in this storm for a long time. He could hear it in the way the engines ran, 2 of them sounding wrong when one of them sounding very wrong, and they were coming straight for his lot. Walter stepped back from the door. His first thought, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it was not a generous one, 12 motorcycles pulling into a struggling mechanic's lot at 10:47 at night in a storm. This severe meant 12 people who wanted something from him. Work he might not be able to do, parts he might not have, and payment that would complicate everything when it turned out he couldn't cover his overhead with whatever they offered. His second thought was about the eviction notice in his jacket pocket. He could say the shop was closed. He could say he didn't have the parts. Both things were possibly true. The motorcycles pulled into his lot. They parked one by one in a rough semicircle outside the garage door, the way people park when they're too exhausted to think about organization. Engines cut. The sound of rain filled everything. And then the riders began climbing off their bikes with the slow and careful movements of people who had been cold and wet and scared for long enough that their bodies weren't working right anymore. Walter stood in his doorway and watched them. They were wearing club leathers, all of them. And even through the rain, even from 15 feet away, he could read the patches. He had been in Red Hollow long enough to recognize the name Hell's Angels. He felt the thing in his chest that most people would have felt in that moment. Not exactly. Walter was 71 years old and had been around long enough to know that a motorcycle club member in distress in a rainstorm was first, and before anything else, a human being in distress in a rainstorm. But caution, the instinctive, involuntary kind. The figure walking toward him was smaller than he expected, maybe 5'6", blonde hair plastered flat by the rain jacket soaked through boots, leaving wet prints on the concrete as she came under the overhang and pulled off her helmet in one motion. She was a woman, late 30s, maybe 40. Her face was exhausted and cold and carrying something that looked like it was trying very hard not to be fear. She looked at Walter Hayes. Walter looked at her. "Sir." Her voice was steady, but only barely. "2 bikes are broken. Not riding rough broken, stopped completely broken. One of our riders took a fall about 4 miles back when a gust hit him wrong. He's not seriously hurt, but his shoulder is bad, and we can't get him back on a bike until someone looks at it. Every road ahead of us is closed. The highway patrol turned us back 20 minutes ago. We have nowhere to go." Walter listened to every word. When she finished, there was a moment, just a moment, where neither of them spoke. The rain came down hard on the overhang above them. Behind her, 11 people stood in the wet dark, trying not to show how cold they were. "I'm Victoria Lawson," she said. "Most people call me Vicky. I'm the chapter leader. Whatever you need money, whatever, we can work it out. But I need you to tell me you can help us because I am running out of options." Walter looked past her at the group. He looked at the 2 bikes that had been pushed in by hand, not riding under their own power, exactly as she said. He looked at the man standing slightly apart from the others, arm held close to his body, jaw tight with the particular expression of someone managing pain they weren't going to mention. He looked at all of it. And he would think about this later in the way you think about the moments that turned out to matter. He thought about Evelyn, about the things she used to say when he got too caught up in what something was going to cost him. A person doesn't need to have everything to give something. Bring them inside, Walter said. All of you. Nobody stays outside in this storm. Vicky Lawson looked at him for 1 second with an expression he couldn't quite read. Relief or something that hadn't decided yet whether it was relief because it was still afraid of being wrong. Then she turned around. Inside, she called out. He's taking us in. Move. The 12 of them came through his door, dripping on his concrete floor, bringing the cold in with them like a second storm. Walter stepped aside to let them pass, and then he closed the door behind the last one and looked around at his garage, his small, outdated 12 days from gone garage, now full of people in wet leather jackets who didn't know his name. He hadn't been this far from alone in 2 years. He didn't say that out loud. He walked past them to his workbench and picked up his clipboard. The 2 bikes that won't run, I need to look at them now before anything else. The rest of you, there's a space heater against the back wall. It's not much, but it works. Coffee machine in the corner is on cups or in the cabinet above it. Help yourself. He paused. The man with the shoulder, what's his name? Marcus, Vicky said. Walter nodded. Marcus, come sit over here under the light. Let me see what you're working with. Marcus turned out to be a large man made temporarily small by pain. He was maybe 45, built like someone who had spent 20 years doing physical work, and he was moving his right arm with the careful economy of a person who had learned very recently exactly which movements made it worse. He sat on the stool Walter pointed him to and submitted to being examined without complaint, which Walter noted and respected. Collarbone, Walter asked, fingers pressing carefully along the ridge of the bone. Marcus made a sound through his teeth. Feels like it. It's not broken, Walter said. I can feel it. It's intact. But you've got a separation at the AC joint, a acromioclavicular, where the collarbone meets the shoulder. He stepped back. You need a sling ice and a doctor in the morning. You don't need an emergency room tonight unless the pain gets significantly worse or you start losing feeling in your arm. Either of those happen, you tell me immediately. Understand? Marcus looked at him. You a mechanic or a doctor? Mechanic, Walter said. But I've been operating on things that don't work for 38 years. Turns out the principles are similar. He turned to the cabinet under the workbench and came out with an ace bandage and 2 ibuprofen from a first aid kit that was older than most of his customers. Take these. I'm going to improvise a sling. It won't be pretty, but it'll hold until morning. I know you don't need it, Walter said, cutting him off gently. You're going to have it anyway. There was a pause. Marcus looked at him again with an expression that was harder to read than the pain. Then he nodded. Vicky was watching from 6 feet away. She didn't say anything. The first broken bike told its story fast. Walter crouched beside it with a flashlight and had the primary problem identified in 4 minutes. Transmission damage not catastrophic, but real. The secondary shaft bearing had gone, probably from a combination of age and the vibration stress of riding through wind gusts, strong enough to move the bike sideways. He could fix it. He had the bearing in stock, a near miracle given how old the bike was, but Walter stocked parts that other mechanics had stopped carrying because he believed in finishing what you started. The second bike was more complicated and more interesting. It had died electrically. The rain had found a way into the connector housing for the main fuse block, not through any failure in the bike's engineering, but through a hairline crack in the housing seal that had probably been there for months and had finally admitted enough water during tonight's storm to short out the entire system. The bike wasn't broken so much as temporarily convinced it was. Walter understood that distinction. He straightened up and looked at his workbench. By any reasonable standard, what he was being asked to do was not reasonable. 2 complex repairs tonight with the tools he had for strangers who had shown up uninvited during the worst weather event in recent memory. He was tired. He was 71. His hands ached in the cold in a way they hadn't used to. He pulled on his work gloves. He went to work. The garage had its own atmosphere at night. Walter had always known that. During the day, it was a workspace, functional, purposeful, organized around the tasks at hand. At night, it became something else, something quieter and larger somehow, even though the building itself didn't change. He had done some of his best work at night. He thought more clearly when the world outside was dark and still, when the only sounds were the ones he was making and the ones the machines made in response to him. Tonight, the garage had 11 other people in it, and that changed things. He was aware of them the way you're aware of a fire on a cold night Not always looking at it, but always knowing where it is. They were watching him. Not all of them, not all the time, but he could feel the attention. The way it shifted toward him when he moved to a new part of the bike. The way conversations dropped off when he made a sound that meant he'd found something. He didn't perform for them, he just worked. A man named Ethan had come to stand nearby, not too close, not crowding the work, but close enough that Walter could see him clearly. Late 30s, posture that said military without advertising it. He watched Walter's hands with a particular quality of attention, the kind that wasn't casual. Acromioclavicular, Ethan said after a while. That's not a word you pull out of thin air. No, Walter agreed, not looking up from the connector housing he was cleaning with a dry cloth. You a medic at some point? No, but I drove an ambulance for 2 years in the 80s before I took over the garage. You learn things. He paused. You were military. It wasn't a question. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Marines, 2 tours. Yeah. Then you know how to be useful without being in the way. A beat. I do. Good, Walter said. Hold this. He handed Ethan the flashlight. And like that, without negotiation or ceremony, they became a 2-person team. Sometime around midnight, Vicky brought him coffee. She set it on the edge of the workbench, the correct edge, the one where there was nothing she could knock over by putting it there, and didn't say anything. She watched him work for a moment. You do this often, she asked. Take in strays. Walter considered the question seriously the way he considered most things. Define strays. People who just show up. Less than I used to, he said. Town's quieter than it was. He took the coffee without stopping what he was doing with his other hand. You ride long distances, often. Every summer, sometimes fall if the weather cooperates. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Usually cooperates better than tonight. Where were you headed? Glacier, annual run. We do it every October, been doing it 8 years. She paused. We've hit bad weather before. Never quite like this. Walter nodded. He set the screwdriver down and reached for a different tool and said without particularly meaning it as an opening, my son used to ride Glacier every year from the time he was old enough. Said it was the only road in America that made him feel like he was moving forward and standing still at the same time. He wasn't sure why he said it. He didn't usually talk about Ryan, not to people he had just met, not to most people at all. Vicky didn't fill the silence right away, which he appreciated. What happened to him? She asked finally. Colorado, Walter said. 2019, he was on a cross-country run. A car came into his lane on a mountain descent. He picked up the tool he'd been reaching for. He died on a road he loved. I've tried to find a way to be okay with that. Have you? She asked it the way someone asks when they actually want to know. Not completely, he said, but I'm still working on it. Vicky looked at the wall of photographs. She looked at it for a long time. Is he up there, 3rd row, 7th from the left? Blue helmet. She found it. She looked at it. He's got your eyes, she said. Walter stopped working just a second, just long enough to feel it. Then he started again. He did, he said. Yeah. The second bike was the harder problem, but it was also the more satisfying one. Walter always felt that about electrical work, there was something almost philosophical about the way a vehicle could lose all its willingness to function, not because anything was physically broken, but because the flow of information had been interrupted. He had once told Evelyn that fixing an electrical fault was less like mechanical repair and more like helping someone remember who they were. She had looked at him and said, Walter, you are the only person I have ever met who finds philosophy in a fuse box. He had taken it as a compliment. The connector housing was the problem. He cleaned it. He sealed the crack with a compound that was not technically designed for motorcycle applications, but that he had used for this exact purpose 3 times before, and that he knew from experience would hold. He replaced the fuse. He dried every contact in the block with patient, careful work, and the kind of attention that can't be taught because it comes from caring about the result. At 2:15 in the morning, he reconnected the battery, stepped back and nodded to Ethan. Try it, he said. The owner of the bike, a man named Derek, who had been watching from the other side of the garage for the last hour, with the expression of someone who has been told his dog might make it, walked forward, swung onto the seat and hit the starter. The engine caught. The garage erupted, not loudly, not in the wild, performative way of people who wanted to make noise, But 12 people who had been cold and scared and stuck on the wrong side of the worst storm in 40 years suddenly remembered how to breathe, and the sound of that collective and involuntary was something Walter felt more than heard. Derek sat on his bike with the engine running and his hands on the handlebars and his head down for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet and he wasn't going to apologize for it. "Thank you," he said. Walter nodded. "Don't thank me yet. The seal I used on that housing is going to hold tonight and probably through the week, but you need to get to a dealership and have them replace the housing properly within the next 10 days. If you wait longer than that and it rains hard again, you'll be right back here." Derek stared at him. "Right, yeah, I will do that." A pause. "I'll definitely do that." "Good." Walter turned back to the workbench. It was Ethan who noticed the handmade tools first. He had been around mechanics enough in the Marines and in civilian life, both to know what workshop tools were supposed to look like. And some of the things on Walter's pegboard were not what you found in any catalog he had ever seen. They were modified. Some of them looked homemade outright, built from other tools, the way someone builds a sentence from words that exist but arranges them into something that didn't exist before. "These are yours," he said, touching the edge of one without picking it up. "Some of them," Walter said, "the specialized ones. When you work on a wide enough range of bikes over long enough, you run into problems that existing tools don't solve well. You either stop solving those problems or you make better tools." Ethan looked at the pegboard for a long moment. "You make a lot of your own tools." "More as the years went on," Walter said. "Parts get discontinued. Tools stop being manufactured, and the bike's still there, the problem's still real, so you improvise." Ethan looked at the repair notes on the bench. They were handwritten in a small, precise script, each one labeled by bike model and repair date going back years. "You keep records of everything." "I keep records of everything," Walter confirmed. "When I repair a machine, I write down what failed and why, and what I did, and whether it worked, and what I do differently. Every bike that's ever come through here has a record." "Why?" Walter considered this. "Because the next one might have the same problem, and I might not remember the answer unless I wrote it down the first time." He paused. "Also because it matters. What happened here? These machines came in broken and left working. That's worth keeping." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're describing institutional knowledge." "I'm describing a mechanic keeping notes," Walter said. "No," Ethan said slowly. "You're describing institutional knowledge. The kind the military spends billions trying to preserve and mostly fails at. You're doing it by hand in a garage in Montana." Walter looked at him. He said. The quietest person in the room had been quiet all night. Walter had noticed him early, the older man, in the simple jacket, silver-haired, sitting on an overturned crate near the back of the garage. He wasn't the oldest person in the room. At 71, Walter had that distinction. But this man had a quality of age that suggested experience rather than just time. He watched everything. He said very little. When others talked, he listened with a particular focused attention that most people don't maintain for long. When Walter moved, this man watched him, not in a way that made him uncomfortable, more in the way of someone who is looking for something specific and thinks they might be looking in the right place. Walter hadn't asked his name yet. He would get to it. There was work to do. By 3:30, the first bike, the transmission job, was repaired, tested, and confirmed ready to run. By 4:15, Marcus's sling was holding, and his color was better, and he had consented to lying down on the old couch in the corner that Walter kept around for exactly this kind of situation, which had not come up in a long time. By 5:10, every bike in the garage had been inspected, not just the 2 broken ones, but all 12, because Walter was who he was, and he wasn't going to let 12 motorcycles sit in his garage for a night without checking their tire pressure and brake lines and chain tension. 2 of the other bikes had issues. He flagged nothing dangerous, but things that would become dangerous within a few weeks of hard riding. He told the owners directly with the specific information they needed to address it and didn't charge them for the inspection. At 5:30 in the morning, the storm stopped. It didn't slow down gradually. It stopped. The rain cut off, the wind died, and through the high windows on the south side of the garage, the sky began to change color. Nobody moved for a moment. Then slowly people started waking up from the places they'd settled for the night, the floor, the couch, the folding chairs Walter had put out. Someone made more coffee. Someone else pushed the garage door up and cold morning air came in fresh and clean, the way air is after a storm has stripped it. The riders began checking their bikes. Walter watched from his workbench, cleaning his tools the way he always did at the end of a job. Vicky came to him while the others were getting ready. "We owe you," she said. She had cash in her hand, not a small amount. Walter shook his head. He didn't do it dramatically. He just shook it and went back to cleaning the wrench. "I mean it," she said. "You stayed up all night. You gave us your parts. We can't just—" "You can," Walter said, "and you will." He looked up at her. "I didn't help you because I wanted something back. I helped you because you needed it and I could. Those are the only two conditions that should apply." Vicky Lawson stared at him. She had been running a motorcycle club chapter for 9 years. She had dealt with a very wide range of human beings. She was not easily surprised. "All right," she said finally. It came out soft. "Ride safe," Walter said. They filed out one by one, starting their engines in the cool morning air. Walter stood in the garage doorway and watched them go the way he always stood in the doorway at the end of a job, because there was something about the moment when a machine left under its own power that never got old even after 38 years. The older man, the quiet one with the silver hair, was the last to go. He walked to Walter. He stopped in front of him. He looked at Walter for a moment the way he had been looking at him all night, with that focused, searching attention. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and came out with a card, a plain card, white minimal. He took Walter's hand and pressed it into his palm and closed Walter's fingers around it. "Don't read it until we're gone," he said. His voice was calm, deliberate. He walked to his bike. He started it. He rode out of the lot and down the highway and into the morning light. Walter watched them all until the last engine sound had faded to nothing. The lot was empty. The garage was his again, just him and the tools and the photographs and the coffee machine and the eviction notice in his jacket pocket. He looked down at the card in his hand. He opened his fingers. He read the name. The wrench he was holding hit the concrete floor. He didn't hear it. He was reading the card again. Charles Whitmore, founder, Whitmore Motorcycle Industries. Walter stood in the morning light in his garage doorway, and he had the particular feeling, not happiness, not quite, not yet, but something older and quieter than happiness, of a man who does not yet understand what has just begun. Walter stared at the card for a long time, not because he needed to read it again. He had read it 3 times in 30 seconds, and the words had not changed. Charles Whitmore, founder, Whitmore Motorcycle Industries. The name was printed in a clean, modest font, no gold embossing, no corporate logo, nothing that announced itself. Just the name and the title and a phone number in the bottom right corner. He picked up the wrench from the floor. He set it on the workbench. He put the card in his jacket pocket next to the eviction notice and stood there for a moment with both hands resting flat on the bench, the way he did when he needed to think something through without his hands getting involved. Charles Whitmore. Walter was 71 years old and had been in the motorcycle business for 38 of those years, which meant he knew exactly who Charles Whitmore was without needing to look it up. Whitmore Motorcycle Industries had started as a 2-man operation in a garage in Tennessee in the late 1970s, a fact that had always meant something to Walter, the kind of origin story that felt personal even when it wasn't yours. By the mid-90s, it had become one of the most respected mid-sized manufacturers in the country. Not the biggest, not the flashiest, but the kind of company that people who understood motorcycles understood, that cared about how a machine felt under your hands, not just how it looked in a photograph. Charles Whitmore had built that, had walked away from a corporate buyout offer in 2008 that would have made him extraordinarily wealthy and would have turned his company into a brand name on someone else's spreadsheet. Had said no publicly and without apology in a statement that Walter had cut out of a trade magazine and taped to the inside of his tool cabinet door, where it had lived ever since. "We build motorcycles, not products, not units, not market segments. Motorcycles. The day that changes is the day I close the doors myself." That was who had spent the night sleeping in his garage on an overturned milk crate. Walter took the card out of his pocket and looked at it one more time. Then he put it back. He picked up his coffee cup, empty had been empty for an hour, and stood there holding it. He said. Then he went to refill it because there was nothing else useful to do at 6 in the morning, and because the coffee machine was still on And because Evelyn had bought it for him and it still worked, and some things you hold on to for reasons that don't need to be explained. He didn't call. That first day, he did not call. He told himself it was because he didn't know what to say. And that was partially true, but it was also because Walter Hayes had a deep and long-standing suspicion of situations that seemed too good, not because he was a pessimist. He wasn't exactly, but because he had lived long enough to know that the distance between what a moment looked like and what it actually was could be considerable. A man hands you a card in the morning light after you've worked through the night for him, and it feels significant. It feels like something. But feelings at 6 in the morning after no sleep with an eviction notice in your pocket and your whole life balanced on the next 12 days, those feelings needed to be weighted carefully. He opened the garage at 8, not because he had customers. He hadn't had a morning appointment in 4 months. He opened it because he always opened it at 8. Routine was the skeleton that held everything else upright, and Walter Hayes understood this the way old men understand things that younger men think are limitations. He swept the floor. He reorganized the tools he had used the night before. He wiped down the 2 bikes he had repaired already, gone their owners riding south through the post-storm morning, and returned the parts drawers to order. He checked the repair notes he had written up during the night, neat and precise, even at 3 in the morning, because sloppiness in records led to sloppiness in repair, and Walter did not do sloppiness. At 9:15, Earl Briggs called. Earl was the loan officer at Red Hollow Community Bank and had been for 11 years and was not a bad man, which Walter had to remind himself of regularly. He was a man doing a job that sometimes required him to deliver information that other people found devastating. He delivered it consistently and without cruelty, which was probably the best you could ask. Walter, Earl said, "I want to check in. The deadline is coming up fast and I haven't heard from you." "I know the deadline, Earl. I know you. No, I'm calling. 'Cause look, I want to be straight with you. There's been some interest in the property." Walter was quiet. "A developer out of Billings," Earl continued. "They've been looking at parcels on the highway for a commercial project. They've expressed interest in your location specifically. Now, nothing is finalized, nothing is committed." "How much time do I have?" Walter said. His voice was even. He made it even on purpose. 13 days from today." "Walter, I'm not calling to put pressure on you. I'm calling because I want you to have the full picture. If there's anything you can—" "I understand the full picture," Walter said. "Thank you for calling, Earl." He hung up. He stood with his hand still on the phone. A developer from Billings. He knew what that meant. It meant a gas station or a chain restaurant or a storage facility, something with a corporate logo, and a lease agreement and no memory of what had been there before. He had watched it happen to the hardware store on 2nd Street and to the old diner on Route 12 and to 3 other buildings in Red Hollow that had once been something specific and personal and were now something generic and replaceable. He took his hand off the phone. I went back to sweeping. He did not call Charles Whitmore. The second day was quieter than the first, which was saying something. Walter's only visitor was Pete Durnan, who ran the auto parts store 2 blocks over and sometimes walked down to talk when he had a slow afternoon. Pete was 64 and had worked in Red Hollow his entire life and had the particular quality of a man who had watched his town change around him and had made a kind of peace with it that was neither surrender nor denial, but something in between. "Heard you had some excitement Thursday night," Pete said, settling onto the stool by the workbench. 12 stranded bikers in the storm," Walter said without looking up from the carburetor. He was cleaning a carburetor from a customer's bike that had been dropped off a week ago before the storm, one of the last actual jobs he had. 2 bikes with mechanical failures. 1 injury. "You fixed them." "I fixed them." Pete was quiet for a moment. "In the middle of that storm, at your age." "I appreciate the confidence, Pete. I didn't mean—" Pete stopped, started again. "I mean, most guys would have turned them away." "I know," Walter said. "Why didn't you?" Walter set the carburetor down. He thought about it honestly, the way Pete's questions sometimes made him think about things honestly, because Pete asked them the way a friend asked, not performing curiosity, but actually wanting the answer. "Because they needed help and I could help," he said. "And because I think about what this place was supposed to be for. What I built it for. Not the money, Pete. I never built it for the money, which is maybe why the money part went the way it did." He picked the carburetor back up. This garage was supposed to be the kind of place where a person could bring something broken and leave with it working again. That's what I told Evelyn when we started. That was the whole idea. The storm didn't change the idea. Pete looked at the wall of photographs. He had looked at that wall 100 times over the years, and it seemed to require looking at again now. The bank called you, Pete said. It wasn't a question. Earl called me yesterday. In 13 days, Walter said. Developer from Billings is interested. Pete made a sound low in his throat, a sound that expressed without words exactly what Walter felt about that. You got anything lined up, any option at all? Walter thought about the card in his jacket pocket. He had moved the card that morning from his jacket to the small tin on his workbench where he kept receipts and important paperwork. He could see it from where he was standing. White card, clean, print, plain as anything. Maybe, he said. Pete looked at him. Maybe something good or maybe something you don't want to talk about yet. Maybe something I don't understand yet, Walter said, which is different from both. Pete nodded slowly. He knew Walter well enough not to push past that. All right, you need anything from the store? Not today, but thank you. After Pete left, Walter stood alone in the garage for a long moment. He looked at the tin with the card in it. He looked at the photographs. He looked at Ryan's picture, third row, seventh, from the left blue helmet, that grin that was somehow simultaneously his mother's and his own, and nobody else's at all. Then he picked up the phone. He dialed the number. It rang twice. This is Charles. The voice was unhurried, alert, the voice of someone who answered his own phone. Walter opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, This is Walter Hayes, Red Hollow, Montana. You left a card. There was a pause, not a long one, not uncertain, but the kind of pause that means a person is placing you correctly, finding the right file in the right drawer. Walter, Charles Whitmore said, I was wondering when you'd call. I almost didn't, Walter said. I know, said Charles. Men like you usually don't. That's part of what makes you interesting. Walter sat down on his stool. It was the first time he had sat down all day. What does that mean? It means, Charles said, that most people who spend the night doing what you did Thursday, up all night working on machines for strangers, giving away parts they can't afford to give, refusing payment in the morning, most of those people call the next day. They want to know what the card means, what's in it for them, how to leverage the situation. A pause. You waited 2 days. And when you called, the first thing you said was your name and where you're from, not, do you remember me, or I wanted to follow up. Just your name and where you're from, like you were introducing yourself for the first time. Walter wasn't sure what to say to that. Mr. Whitmore, Charles. Charles, I don't know what you're looking for. I don't know what that card was supposed to mean. I've been sitting with it for 2 days and I still don't know. So I'm calling to ask directly because I'm too old to do this in a way that wastes either of our time. Charles was quiet for a moment. Walter had the sense of a man who found direct questions not uncomfortable, but genuinely welcome. Fair enough, Charles said. Here's the direct answer. I've been looking for something for about 3 years. I've visited over 60 workshops across 12 states. I've sent people to visit workshops I couldn't get to myself. I've been looking for a specific kind of mechanic, not the best credentialed, not the most modern, not the most efficient. A specific kind. He paused. Thursday night I found it. Walter's hand tightened slightly on the phone. What kind, he said. The kind that still knows what a motorcycle is for, Charles said. Not a product, not an asset, a machine that carries a person from where they are to where they need to go, and if you're lucky, shows them something about themselves on the way. The kind of mechanic who understands that down to their hands, not because they were taught it, because they lived it. Another pause. Those handwritten repair notes, Walter, tell me about those. Walter blinked. Of all the things he had expected to be asked about, they're just records. No, they're not. Ethan told me about them this morning. He said each record includes what failed and why, and what you tried, and what worked, and what you'd do differently. That's right. And how many bikes have records in that system? Walter thought about it. Every bike that's come through this garage since 1991. Before that, I kept records too, but they weren't as systematic. So roughly 3,000, maybe a few over. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 full seconds. 3,000 individual repair records, Charles said, handwritten, maintained continuously for over 30 years. Yes. Walter, Charles said, and his voice had changed, not dramatically, but in the way that a room changes when someone opens a window. I want to come see you. Not this week. I have commitments. I can't move. But within the next 10 days, I want to come to Red Hollow, and I want to see the garage, and I want to talk to you in person about something significant. Can you give me that 10 days? Walter looked at the tin with the card in it. He looked at the eviction notice that he had moved to the shelf above the bench because having it in his pocket was becoming intolerable. 13 days, Earl had said yesterday. 10 days was cutting it close. 10 days was cutting it very close. I can give you 10 days, Walter said, but I need you to know something first. Tell me. The bank is foreclosing on this building in 13 days. I don't have the money to stop it. I'm telling you that, not because I want you to solve it. I'm not calling you for that reason, and I want to be clear about it. I'm telling you because if you're planning to come see this garage, you should know that in 13 days it might not be mine anymore. The silence this time was different, thoughtful. Walter had the sense of a man recalibrating something. I appreciate you telling me that, Charles said. I don't want anything to happen between now and whenever you come that looks like charity, Walter said. I'm not interested in charity. I never have been. I know, Charles said. I could tell that when you turned down Vicky's money. Then we understand each other. We do, Charles said. Walter, I'll be there in 9 days. Whatever the state of the garage when I arrive, I'll be there. Walter hung up. He sat on his stool. He looked around his garage, the tools on the pegboard, the photographs on the wall, the coffee machine in the corner, the repair records stacked in the cabinet under the bench, 3,000 of them, going back 30 years. He looked at Ryan's photograph. Well, he said to it, something's happening. He got up and went back to work. The days that followed had a particular quality that Walter hadn't felt in a long time. Not exactly hope. He was too careful for hope. At this stage, too experienced with the distance between a promising phone call and an actual outcome. But something adjacent to it. A sense that the next thing mattered in a way the previous things had not, which changed how he moved through each day without changing what he actually did in it. He opened at 8. He worked on the carburetor job and 2 smaller repairs that came in a leaking fork seal on an older Harley that belonged to a man named Greg, who drove 40 minutes from Clearwater to bring it to Walter, specifically because Greg's father had brought bikes to this garage and his father's father before that, and Greg was the kind of man who honored that kind of continuity. Walter fixed the fork seal and adjusted the idle while he had it and didn't charge for the extra 20 minutes. And Greg shook his hand on the way out the way men shake hands when they mean something by it. He closed at 6. He cooked dinner, something simple. He had always eaten simply. Evelyn had been the cook, and he had never learned the way he should have. He sat at his table and ate, and then cleaned up, and then went back to the garage because the evenings were harder than the days, and work was the thing that helped. I was in the garage on the 3rd evening after the phone call going through the repair records in the oldest cabinet, not for any particular reason, just because they were there, and they settled him when he found Ryan's. He had known it was there, of course. He had filed it himself in the spring of 2018 when Ryan had brought the Triumph Bonneville in for its final pre-trip inspection. The record was in Walter's own handwriting, his usual format bike model and year owner name, presenting issue work, performed outcome notes. Under owner name it said Ryan James Hayes. Under presenting issue it said pre-trip inspection before extended cross-country ride. Under work performed it filled most of the page, everything they had done together over those 2 years of rebuilding compressed into a final summary. Under outcome complete, all systems operational, machine ready for extended travel. Under notes, Walter had written something he didn't write in other records, proud of this one. Both the bike and the man. He sat with the record in his hands for a while. Then he folded it back carefully and closed the cabinet. He wasn't sure why he'd found it tonight. He wasn't sure it meant anything. But he sat with it for a few minutes anyway, the feeling of it, the particular weight of a piece of paper that carried everything and couldn't carry enough. On the 7th day after the phone call, Ethan Cole drove up. Not with the group alone. A single bike, no advance notice. He knocked on the open garage door at 10 in the morning and stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking like a man who wasn't entirely sure he'd made the right decision coming. Walter looked up from the bench. Ethan, he said. Walter, a beat. You got a few minutes. I've got nothing but minutes. Come in. Ethan came in. He didn't go to the stool by the bench. He walked to the wall of photographs and stood in front of it for a moment, looking at it with the same focused attention he'd brought to everything Thursday night. "Charles is coming," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "He told me 9 days, so 2 days from now." Walter watched him. "You knew he was going to call." "I suspected," Ethan said. He turned from the wall. "I've been with Charles's company for 4 years. I work in something we call legacy development, which sounds more complicated than it is. Basically, I help find things and people and knowledge that are at risk of disappearing. Traditional craft techniques, specialized skills, manufacturing knowledge that exists in one person's head and nowhere else." He paused. "I'm the one who suggested he travel with the chapter this year. I knew the route went through Red Hollow." Walter was very still. "You knew about this garage," he said. "I knew about you," Ethan said. "Not specifically, not personally, but I'd heard your name 3 times in the past 2 years from 3 different people in the industry, all of them older mechanics, all of them saying some version of the same thing. If you want to know how bikes used to be built and how to fix them the right way, there's a man in Red Hollow, Montana." He met Walter's eyes. 3 independent sources, 3 years apart. "In my line of work, that means something." Walter sat down on his stool. "The storm," he said. "The storm was the storm. That was real, that wasn't planned. But yes, when the storm hit and Vicky pulled off the highway and I saw the sign for your garage, I knew where we were. And I watched you work all night, and everything those 3 people had told me turned out to be true and more." Ethan paused. "The tools, Walter, the records, the way you explained the fork seal geometry to Derek when you were fixing the electrical, you didn't have to explain it. He couldn't have understood half of it. But you explained it anyway because you wanted him to understand his own machine. That's not mechanics. That's teaching. That's preservation." Walter looked at his hands. They were old hands. They carried the marks of the work, the calluses, the small scars, the stain that never quite came out from certain compounds. He had never thought of them as anything other than the tools of his trade. "What is Charles planning?" he said. "When he comes, what is he actually planning?" Ethan sat down on the stool across from him. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "He's going to offer you a partnership," Ethan said. "A real one. Not a buyout, not a consulting arrangement. A partnership. He wants to rebuild this garage, not replace it, rebuild it into the first Whitmore Heritage Center. A place where traditional motorcycle craft is taught, where young mechanics, veterans, people who can't afford trade school can learn the way you learned hands-on from someone who knows what they're doing and why it matters." Walter looked at him. "Your records would become the foundation of a curriculum," Ethan continued. "Your tools, the modified ones, the ones you built yourself, would be documented, replicated, used to teach. The method you've developed over 38 years would be preserved and passed on instead of disappearing when..." He stopped. "When I die," Walter said without bitterness. Ethan met his eyes. "Yes." The garage was quiet. Outside, a truck went by on the highway. The coffee machine in the corner made its familiar rattling complaint and then settled. Walter looked at the photographs on the wall. "I thought about the developer from Billings. He thought about Earl Briggs and the 13 days. He thought about Ryan, who had loved motorcycles the way you love something that costs you everything and gives you back more, and who had learned to love them in this building, at this workbench, from his father's hands. He thought about Evelyn saying a person doesn't need to have everything to give something." 2 days, Walter said. 2 days, Ethan confirmed. "All right." Walter stood. He picked up the tool he'd been holding when Ethan knocked. "You drove 40 minutes to tell me all of that in person." "I did. Why, Charles would have told me when he came." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. "Because I wanted you to have time to think about it before he arrived," he said. "Because a man who's been alone with something for a long time can need a little runway before a big conversation. And because," he stopped again, looked up, "because I've been in a lot of garages and I've talked to a lot of mechanics, and I've never met one who wrote 'proud of this one' in a repair record about his son's motorcycle. And I thought you deserved to know that what you've built here is real and someone is coming to tell you so before it's too late." Walter stood with the tool in his hand and did not say anything for a moment. The thing about grief that people who haven't carried it don't understand is that it lives alongside everything else. It doesn't take up space so much as it changes the quality of the space. Walter had learned to carry it without letting it stop him. But every so often, without warning, something opened a door, and the whole weight of it was right there again, completely present, not reduced by time at all. He breathed through it. "Thank you, Ethan," he said. His voice was steady. He made it steady. Ethan nodded once. He stood up. He put his jacket on. "I'll be back in 2 days with Charles," he said. "You don't have to do anything different between now and then. Just be here. Just be exactly what you already are." He walked out of the garage. Walter listened to his motorcycle start and pull out of the lot and fade down the highway. Then he set the tool down on the bench. He walked to the wall. He stood in front of Ryan's photograph, third row, seventh, from the left blue helmet, that grin. "He's coming," Walter said quietly. "Charles Whitmore is coming. And apparently 3 people I've never met told a man I didn't know that this place was worth something." He paused. "I don't know what happens next. I genuinely don't know. But I think you'd want me to open the door." He stood there another moment. Then he turned around and picked up the tool and went back to work, because that was what you did. Because the work was always there. Because the work was the whole thing and always had been. And in 2 days, Charles Whitmore was going to walk through that door. And Walter Hayes was going to be exactly what he was, a mechanic in a small garage in Red Hollow, Montana, with old tools and handwritten records, and a coffee machine that rattled, and a wall full of photographs of people who had brought him broken things and left with them whole. That was enough. That had always been enough. He just hadn't known until now that anyone else could see it. Charles Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday morning 11 days after the storm. Not in a car, not in one of the black SUVs that Walter had half expected, because that was the kind of arrival a man of his stature made in the movies. The entourage, the vehicles with tinted windows, the assistant walking 3 steps behind with a tablet and an agenda. Walter had not been able to stop himself from imagining it, and he had felt faintly embarrassed by the imagining, because he was not a man who spent time on that kind of speculation. What he heard instead at 9:40 in the morning was a single motorcycle engine pulling into the lot. Walter was at the bench. He had been at the bench since 7 working on a brake caliper job that didn't need to be done until Thursday, but that he had pulled forward because the waiting was the worst part and work was the only thing that did anything useful about waiting. He heard the engine. He set down the caliper. He did not immediately go to the door. He waited until the engine cut. Then he heard footsteps on the concrete outside. Then Ethan's knocked 2 quick raps, the same as 2 days ago. "Come in," Walter said. They came in together, Ethan first, then Charles Whitmore, and behind Charles, a woman Walter hadn't met yet, early 40s, carrying a leather portfolio, and moving with the precise economic efficiency of someone who had spent years making complex things happen on tight schedules. She stopped just inside the door and looked around the garage the way someone looks at a place they've heard described and are now measuring against the description. Charles stopped in the middle of the garage floor. I didn't say anything at first. He just looked. At the bench, at the tools on the pegboard, at the cabinet where the repair records lived, at the photographs on the east wall. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for a long time and is now seeing for the first time with his own eyes, checking the reality against the version that has been living in his head. Walter waited. Charles turned to him. "You didn't change anything," he said. "Why would I?" Walter said. Charles smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that comes from something landing correctly. "Most people would have cleaned up, organized differently, made it look more like what they thought I expected." "I don't know what you expected," Walter said. "This is what it is." "Yes," Charles said, "it is." He walked toward the workbench. "May I, go ahead." Charles looked at the tools without touching them. He looked at the modified ones, the ones Walter had built himself over the years, adapted from existing tools or constructed from materials that had no business being workshop tools, but turned out to work better than the ones designed for the purpose. He looked at them the way a reader looks at a sentence that says something he's been trying to say for years. "Ethan told me about the repair records," Charles said. 3,000 individual bikes. 3,047, Walter said. "I counted while you were coming." Charles looked at him. "Show me one." Walter opened the cabinet. He pulled a record at random, a 1994 Honda Shadow Fork bearing replacement, March of 2003. He handed it across. "Charles, read it." He read the whole thing, not skimming. He turned it over and read the notes on the back, where Walter had added a follow-up observation from when the same bike came in 2 years later and the repair had held perfectly. "You noted a follow-up," Charles said. "When they came back, I updated the record. Not all of them did, But when they did, I noted it. Why, Bob? Because knowing that a repair held for 2 years is more useful than knowing you made the repair, Walter said. If it failed in 2 years, that's also useful. Either way, the information belongs in the record. Charles set the file card down on the bench. He looked at it for another moment. Then he looked at the woman behind him. Sandra, he said. The woman opened her portfolio and took out a folder. Charles turned back to Walter. I want to tell you what I'm thinking. All of it directly, and I want you to hear it completely before you respond, because some parts of it are going to sound like more than you expected, and I don't want you to stop me before I've finished. Can you do that? Walter nodded. I've been building motorcycles for 46 years, Charles said. I started because I loved machines, because I believed a motorcycle built right was a kind of argument, an argument that the relationship between a person and a machine could be honest, that the machine could tell the truth about itself to anyone who knew how to listen. He paused. I've watched that knowledge, the knowledge of how to listen to a machine, disappear. Not suddenly, slowly. One retired mechanic at a time, one closed garage at a time. The new generation of technicians are trained on computers and diagnostic software, and they're good at what they do, but when the software doesn't have the answer, they stop. Because nobody taught them what to do when the software stops. He stopped. Walter said nothing. What you have in this garage, Charles continued, is a living record of 38 years of problem solving without a net. Every modification on that pegboard is a solution to a problem that the industry didn't provide a solution for. Every entry in those cabinets is a data point in a knowledge base that doesn't exist anywhere else in any form for any price. He picked up the file card again, held it up briefly, set it back down. This is irreplaceable. You are irreplaceable. And in 11 days, both of you are going to disappear. The word landed in the garage like something physical. Walter kept his voice level. You're not wrong about the timeline. I know I'm not. Charles took the folder from Sandra. He put it on the bench in front of Walter. I want to propose something. Not a loan, not a donation, not charity of any kind. I heard you on the phone and I understood you and I respect it, and this is not that. He opened the folder. I want to offer you a partnership, a legal documented, genuine business partnership between Walter Hayes and Whitmore Motorcycle Industries. Here is what that means in specific terms. Walter looked down at the folder. The first page was a summary, 1 page clear. Language, no legal fog. Walter read it the way he read repair records, carefully, completely, without skipping. The bank debt would be resolved not as a gift, but as an advance against the partnership value to be documented and accounted for in the formal agreement. The garage building would be purchased from the bank at fair market value and transferred to a jointly held entity. Walter would hold 51%. Whitmore Industries would hold 49%. Walter looked up. You're giving me controlling interest. Yes. Why? Charles met his eyes. Because this only works being yours the moment you're working for me instead of alongside me. The thing that makes it valuable stops existing. I've seen it happen. You can't buy what you have. You can only partner with it. Walter looked back down at the summary. The garage would be rebuilt, structurally improved equipment, updated facilities expanded, but the original workspace would be preserved intact within the new structure. Walter's tools would remain where they were. The photographs would remain where they were. The workbench would remain. The coffee machine, which Ethan had apparently specifically mentioned in whatever notes he'd sent back, would remain in the corner. Walter stopped on that line. He read it twice. You specified the coffee machine. Ethan was very clear that it was important, Charles said. There was something in his voice, not amusement exactly, but warmth. He didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. Walter thought about Evelyn buying it in 1994 because she said he needed something warm at night. He thought about the fact that he had never told Ethan that story. He thought about the way that some things carry their meaning invisibly in a way that other people can somehow sense without knowing what they're sensing. It stays, Walter said quietly. It stays, Charles confirmed. Walter turned to the next page. The Heritage Center structure, what it would actually be. A training program for 12 students per cohort, 3 cohorts per year. Priority placement for military veterans, people without access to trade, school young mechanics from rural areas where the knowledge was dying fastest. Walter would design the curriculum from his own records. and experience with Ethan's team, helping document and formalize it. A master mechanic from Whitmore Industries would support but not lead. Walter would lead. "I'm 71, Walter said. "I know. I'm not going to be doing this at 85. "No, Charles said. "That's why we start now, while you can build it properly, while you can train the people who will carry it forward. The point isn't to keep you working forever. The point is to transfer what's in your head and your hands into something that survives you. That's a different kind of work, and there's no one else who can do it." Walter turned another page. His own stipend. He hadn't expected a stipend, but it was there, specific and fair enough to live without anxiety for the first time in years. Health coverage, a provision for the partnership to continue paying his living expenses after he stepped back from active teaching, tied to the ongoing use of his records and curriculum. He closed the folder. He put both hands flat on the bench. He looked at Charles Whitmore, this man he had not known existed 9 days ago, who had slept in a corner of his garage on an overturned crate during a storm, and watched him work all night without saying who he was. "You watched me the whole time," Walter said. "Thursday night, you were evaluating me." "Yes." "Well, I thought you were just a stranded rider." "Yes." Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked at the folder. He looked at the wall of photographs. He found Ryan's picture without even trying. Third row, seventh from the left. He could find it with his eyes closed by now. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Charles leaned against the edge of the bench. He thought about the question before answering it, which Walter had noticed was his habit. He thought before he spoke, which was rarer than it should have been. "Because the person you are at 2 in the morning, working alone on a machine for a stranger when nobody knows who you are and nobody's evaluating you, and there's nothing to gain, that's the real person. The one I needed to meet," he paused. "If I'd introduced myself when we arrived, everything you did for the rest of that night would have had my name attached to it. The motivation would have been different even if the work was the same. I couldn't afford to not know which one I was seeing." Walter absorbed this. "That's a ruthless way to evaluate someone," he said. "Yes," Charles said without apology. "It's also the only way that works." A long silence settled between them. Sandra was writing something in her portfolio. Ethan was standing near the photographs, his back to the room, looking at the wall the way he'd looked at it 2 days ago. Walter picked up the folder again. He opened it to the first page and read the summary one more time. Then he set it down. "I have a condition," he said. Charles straightened slightly. "Tell me. The students who come here, the veterans, the young ones, the people who can't afford the other options, they don't pay tuition. Not a dollar. The program covers them completely." Charles looked at him. "That's already in the proposal, page 4. Walter turned to page 4. He read it. It was there. Full scholarship, every student, every cohort. He felt something shift in his chest. A thing that had been held tight for a very long time, releasing slowly the way a seized bolt finally gives after the right combination of pressure and patience. "My wife used to say," Walter started, and then stopped. He didn't usually do this, offer Evelyn's words to people he was conducting business with. But this didn't feel like ordinary business, and Charles Whitmore didn't feel like an ordinary man he was conducting it with. She used to say a person doesn't need to have everything to give something. She said it to me in 1987 when I was trying to decide whether to open this garage. I didn't have the money. I didn't have the certainty. She said that, and I opened the door. Charles was very still. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," he said. "She was the best person I ever knew," Walter said, "and I think she would have—" He stopped again, breathed. "I think she would have said yes." "What do you say?" Charles asked, quietly. Walter looked at him. "I say yes," he said. Nobody in the room performed a reaction. Nobody whooped or applauded or made the moment into something theatrical. Sandra wrote in her portfolio. Ethan at the wall exhaled once slowly without turning around. Charles reached across the bench and shook Walter's hand, a real handshake, the kind where both people mean it. "Good," Charles said. "Then we have work to do." What happened next moved faster than Walter had expected, and he had expected it to move fast. Sandra, whose full name was Sandra Okafor, and who turned out to be Charles's director of operations, and the person who actually made things happen once Charles decided they should have a legal team on the phone within the hour. The bank debt, the number that had been sitting on Walter's chest for 11 days like a physical weight, was addressed by end of business that same day. Not resolved yet, not signed and sealed, but addressed a formal communication to Red Hollow Community Bank from Whitmore Industries legal counsel, notifying them of the pending partnership and the intention to purchase the property, and asking Earl Briggs to hold the foreclosure proceedings pending documentation. Earl Briggs called Walter at 4:30. Walter, Earl said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had been doing a difficult job for 11 years and was experiencing something unexpected in the middle of it. I just received a communication from Whitmore Motorcycle Industries. I know, Walter said. Walter, that's a significant... Earl stopped, started again. Are you doing all right? I think so, Earl, Walter said. I genuinely think so. Good, Earl said. That's good. I'm very glad. A pause. I'll hold the proceedings. Take the time you need. Walter hung up. He stood in the middle of his garage with no tools in his hands, which almost never happened during working hours. He stood there and felt the weight leave. Not all at once, it was more gradual than that, like a pressure releasing through a small valve. But it was going. After 11 days of carrying it, it was going. He walked to the coffee machine. He poured a cup. He drank it standing up, leaning against the wall below the photographs, and looked at Ryan's picture while the coffee cooled. All right, son, he said, all right. The next 2 days were administrative and overwhelming in the specific way that good things can be overwhelming. Not the paralytic kind of overwhelm, but the kind that comes from having more forward motion than you're accustomed to and needing to keep your footing. Sandra sent documents. Walter's daughter-in-law, Ryan's ex-wife, who had stayed in his life long after she had any obligation to call a lawyer friend, who went through the partnership agreement line by line and confirmed it was genuine, equitable, and protective of Walter's interests in every material way. Walter, she said on the phone, and he could hear her trying to keep her voice steady. This is real. This is really happening. I know, Katie, he said. Ryan would have... She stopped. I know, he said. I know he would have. On the third day after Charles's visit, while Sandra was working through the property transfer logistics from her hotel in town, Ethan came back to the garage. This time he brought coffee from the place on 2nd Street and sat across from Walter at the bench, and they talked for 2 hours about the curriculum, what it needed to cover, how it should be structured, what the first cohort of students would need to know before they could begin to understand anything worth knowing. Walter had never thought about his knowledge as a curriculum before. It was just what he knew. The way he knew it was so embedded in the knowing that separating it into teachable components felt strange, like being asked to describe how you walk. But Ethan was good at this. He asked questions that cracked the knowledge open, not the what, but the why, not the technique, but the reasoning behind the technique. Why did Walter open the transmission before checking the electrical on a bike with multiple potential failure points? Because the transmission told you the truth first. The electrical could be intermittent, it could fail under specific conditions and not others, which meant you could chase it wrong for hours. The transmission was always honest, it always showed you exactly where it was. Ethan wrote this down. That's the first lesson of the curriculum, he said. What is machines tell the truth? The mechanic's job is to listen correctly. He looked up. Where did you learn that? Walter thought about it. My father, he said. He wasn't a mechanic, he was a farmer. He said it about the land. He said the land always tells you what it needs. The farmer's job is to stop talking long enough to hear it. Walter paused. I applied it to machines. Turned out it was the same principle. Ethan looked at him for a moment. That he said is going into the curriculum word for word. On the 4th day, Vicki Lawson called. Walter hadn't expected that. He picked up and heard her voice and felt a small jolt of surprise, not unpleasant, just unexpected. Charles told me, she said without preamble. Told you what specifically, Walter asked. Everything, the partnership, the Heritage Center, the fact that you almost didn't call him, and when you did, the first thing you said was your name and where you were from. She paused. He said that was how he knew you were the right person. Walter wasn't sure what to say to that. I wanted to call, Vicki said, because I didn't get to say something properly when we left. After everything you did for us that night, the bikes, Marcus's shoulder, the coffee at midnight, all of it, I just handed you money and you said no, and then we left. And I've been thinking about that. You said thank you, Walter said. Not enough. Her voice was firm, not emotional, or rather emotional in the way that people are when they've decided to say something difficult and they're going to say it regardless. I've been riding for 20 years. I've been stranded on roads and weather before. I've knocked on doors before. You know what most people do. Tell you to find somewhere else, Walter said. Tell you to find somewhere else, she confirmed. And I understand it. It's late. They don't know you. The risk calculation doesn't work out. I understand it completely. But you didn't do that. And you didn't do it in a storm that was trying to kill us on the same night the bank was 13 days from taking everything from you. Her voice changed slightly. I didn't know that Thursday night. Ethan told me afterward about the eviction, about what you were carrying when you opened that door. Walter was quiet. I just want you to know, Vicky said, that it mattered. What you did mattered. Not just the repairs, opening the door. A pause. You didn't have to. You knew it, and you did it anyway. That's the part that matters. Walter thought about the night, the moment at the door when the 12 headlights came out of the rain. The thing in his chest, the caution, the calculation, all the reasonable reasons. And then Evelyn's voice, as clear as it always was when he needed it. A person doesn't need to have everything to give something. My wife told me to, he said simply. Vicky was quiet for a moment. Tell me about her, she said. And Walter did, standing in his garage on a Thursday afternoon with the sun coming through the high windows and his tools on the pegboard and his records in the cabinet and the coffee machine rattling in the corner. He told a woman he had met 5 days ago about Evelyn, who she was, how she thought what she had meant when she said what she said. He talked for 15 minutes, which was more than he had talked about Evelyn to anyone in years. When he finished, Vicky didn't say anything for a moment. Then, she'd be proud of you. Walter's hand tightened on the phone. I hope so, he said. I genuinely hope so. He hung up and stood in his garage and felt very specifically and without embarrassment the truth of it. Whatever happened next, the paperwork, the rebuild the students who hadn't arrived yet, the curriculum that was still being built from his 38 years of working in this room, none of it had happened because he had been trying to save himself. He had been trying to stay true to the thing he had built and the people he had built it for, and the woman who had told him 38 years ago to open the door. The rest of it had come because of that. Not instead of it, because of it. He picked up a wrench. He went back to the bench. He had a brake caliper that still needed finishing, and the work was always there, and the work was always the point, and he understood that now with a clarity that felt like something long held finally landing in exactly the right place. 3 days later, on a Monday morning, Sandra Okafor knocked on the open garage door with a folder under her arm and a look on her face that Walter had already learned to read as we're ready. Signing day, she said. Give me 5 minutes, Walter said. He put down his tools. He washed his hands at the utility sink thoroughly the way you wash your hands when something matters. He dried them. He looked at the photographs on the wall one more time. He looked at Ryan. Here we go, kid, he said. He walked to the door. Sandra handed him the folder. He opened it. He read every page, all 18 of them, the way he did everything completely carefully without skipping. Sandra stood quietly and waited. She did not rush him. Walter noticed this and respected it. When he reached the signature page, he stopped. He read it one more time. Walter James Hayes, master mechanic and co-founder, Whitmore Heritage Motorcycle Center, Red Hollow, Montana. Co-founder. He had not been prepared for that word. Partnership, yes. Heritage Center, yes. But co-founder. The word meant the thing had not existed before him. The word meant he was not joining something. He was beginning something. He picked up the pen. His hand was steady. He signed his name. And 38 years after Evelyn had told him to open a door in a garage he couldn't afford, Walter Hayes opened another one that would never close, while the thing he had built and believed in and refused to give up on had anyone left to walk through it. Sandra took the folder. She shook his hand. She said, Charles asked me to tell you something. What? She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, which suggested it wasn't a frequent thing and was therefore worth something. He said the future should never erase the hands that built the past. Walter looked at her. He looked at his hands, old, scarred, stained with 38 years of good work. Tell him, Walter said, that I'll hold him to that. The construction crew arrived on a Wednesday. Walter had known they were coming. Sandra had sent him the schedule 4 days in advance, broken into phases, each phase with a timeline and a point of contact and a contingency plan, because Sandra operated that way. And Walter had already decided that Sandra Okafor was one of the most competent human beings he had encountered in 71 years of encountering human beings. He had known they were coming, and he had told himself he was prepared for it. He was not prepared for it. There were 11 of them, 2 trucks, a flatbed with equipment, and a project manager named Dylan, who was 32 years old, and shook Walter's hand with the genuine respect of someone who had been thoroughly briefed about who he was dealing with. Dylan was good. Walter could tell that in the first 5 minutes he listened before he talked. He looked at the existing structure before he touched anything, and the first words out of his mouth were not about what they were going to build, but about what they were going to preserve. "Mr. Hayes," Dylan said, standing in the middle of the garage floor and turning slowly to take in the whole space. "Before my crew touches a single thing in here, I need you to walk me through everything that doesn't move. Not just the equipment, everything. If it matters to you, it matters to me. Those are my instructions from Mr. Whitmore and Ms. Okafor both." Walter looked at him. "That's going to take a while," Walter said. "I've got the whole morning," Dylan said. So Walter walked him through it. The workbench original, built in 1908 by Walter and his father-in-law from lumber, they had milled themselves because the commercial benches available at the time weren't the right height for Walter's frame. And his father-in-law had said, "Why buy something wrong when we can build something right?" The tool pegboard, the layout of which had evolved over decades into something that looked arbitrary, but was in fact a precise map of how Walter thought each tool in relation to the next, following the logic of repair sequences he had developed through thousands of jobs. The cabinet system under the bench, the repair records organized chronologically and cross-referenced by bike model in a card system that Walter had built himself, because no commercial filing system served his specific needs. The coffee machine. "This one," Walter said, stopping in front of it, "does not move. It does not get replaced. If it breaks, you fix it. If you can't fix it, you find someone who can." Dylan wrote it down without a flicker of hesitation. "Understood. It's a 1994 Mr. Coffee with a replacement filter housing. The rattling sound it makes is normal. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't normal. It is." "Got it," Dylan said. "My wife bought it for me." Dylan stopped writing. He looked up. "Yes, sir," he said, and the 2 words carried everything they needed to carry. Then they came to the photographs. Walter stood in front of the east wall and was quiet for a moment. He had looked at this wall every day for 30 years. He knew every photograph on it, not just the faces, but the stories behind them, the bikes, the repairs, the conversations. The wall was not decorative. It was a record of a life's work expressed in faces instead of words, and it was the most important thing in the building, and he was about to ask an 11-person construction crew to treat it as such. "Every photograph stays exactly where it is," Walter said. "Same position, same height, same order. During whatever work needs to happen to the wall behind them, they get removed and cataloged and returned to the same position. I'll number them myself so there's no confusion. I'll assign 1 crew member specifically to the photo wall," Dylan said. "Nobody else touches it." Walter nodded. He reached out and straightened a frame that didn't need straightening just to touch it, just to feel the realness of it. "There are 211 photographs," he said. "Each one is a customer. Some of them are gone now. Some of them drove a long way to bring their bikes here because they trusted this place. The wall stays because they deserve to stay." Dylan nodded slowly. He had the expression of a man who had come in expecting a renovation job and was understanding gradually that he was inside something that required a different kind of attention. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly, "I'm going to take good care of this place." Walter looked at him. He believed him. "All right," Walter said. "Let's talk about what you're building." The plan, as Dylan walked him through it, was more elegant than Walter had anticipated. The existing structure would be reinforced and expanded outward on the north and east sides, new space for additional workstations, a classroom area, storage for teaching materials, and student projects. The original workspace would remain in the center unchanged in its dimensions and layout, but surrounded by the new construction, the way a tree gets surrounded by the rings of its own growth. The original space would be visible from everywhere in the expanded building. Students working at the new stations would be able to see Walter's original bench from where they stood. "That was Charles's specific requirement," Dylan said. "The original workspace is the center. Everything else is built around it." Walter stood in his original workspace and looked at where the walls would extend. He thought about what this room had been, the smallness of it, the age, the rust on things that had been there long enough to accept rust as their permanent condition. He thought about what it was about to become. The students are going to walk in here, Walter said slowly, working it out as he spoke. And the first thing they're going to see is the original space, the original tools. That's the idea, Dylan said, before they go to their own stations, before they touch anything modern. Yes. Walter was quiet for a moment. That's right, he said. That's exactly right. You understand what you need before you touch the tools you have. You learn why before you learn how. He looked at Dylan. Charles thought of that. Charles and Ethan, from what I understand, they went back and forth on the layout for about a week. Walter nodded. He felt the thing he was increasingly learning to recognize, not gratitude exactly, which implied a transaction, a balance being settled. Something more like the feeling of being accurately understood, of having someone see what you were doing and build around it in a way that honored the logic of it. He had not felt that in a very long time. The construction started the following Monday, and Walter kept the garage operating through all of it. This had been non-negotiable on his end. He had one more customer job in progress, a full engine rebuild on a vintage Indian Scout that belonged to a man named Howard Park, who had been coming to Walter for 16 years. And Walter was not going to let a construction project interrupt a job that Howard was counting on. Dylan accommodated this without complaint, sequencing his crew's work to leave Walter's active workspace clear during the hours Walter needed it. Howard Park came in on the third day of construction, ostensibly to check on his Indian, and stood in the middle of the organized chaos of a building being remade around him with his mouth slightly open. Walter, Howard said. What in the Whitmore Heritage Motorcycle Center? Walter said, not looking up from the engine. Grand opening in approximately 6 weeks. Whitmore, as in Charles Whitmore, yes. Howard stared at him. Then he looked at the crew working on the east wall, then back at Walter. How did this happen? A storm, Walter said, and an open door. Howard waited for more. Walter didn't provide it. Howard, who was 68 years old and had known Walter for 16 of them, understood that this was all he was going to get for now. Is my Indian going to be ready on time? He said. Thursday, Walter said. Same as I told you. Howard nodded slowly. He looked around the building one more time. Evelyn would have loved this, he said quietly enough, that it was clearly not meant as a conversation starter. Walter's hands slowed for just a half second, then continued. Yeah, he said, she would have. Word spread through Red Hollow, the way words spread in small towns, not through formal announcements or newspaper coverage, but through the specific, intimate network of people who talk to other people, who tell two more. And within a week of the construction starting, Walter was fielding visits from people he hadn't seen in years. Old customers, neighbors, people who had heard something improbable and come to stand in front of it and confirm it with their own eyes. Pete Durnan from the auto parts store came every day at lunch. He would stand just inside the door with his coffee and watch the construction for 15 minutes and then go back to work without saying much. On the 5th day he came, and instead of standing at the door, he walked to the bench and sat on the stool and looked at Walter. I owe you an apology, Pete said. Walter looked at him. For what? For being one of the people who thought you should close this place 2 years ago. Not out loud, I never said it to you, but I thought it. Pete looked at his hands. I thought you were holding on past the point where holding on made sense. I thought you were, I don't know, stubborn, refusing to see what was real. Walter set down his tool. Pete, I was wrong, Pete said. I was wrong about what was real. He gestured at the construction, at the wall, at all of it. This was real. It was real the whole time. I just couldn't see it. Walter looked at his oldest friend in Red Hollow. He looked at the genuine discomfort of a man who had come to say something hard because it needed to be said. You weren't wrong, Walter said. On the numbers, on the practical reality, you weren't wrong at all. The business wasn't viable. I knew that. I stayed anyway. Not because it made business sense, but because something mattered more than sense. He paused. I got lucky, Pete. What happened here, I got lucky. You got lucky because you stayed, Pete said. Walter thought about that. Yeah, he said. Maybe that's right. Ethan arrived on a Thursday 2 weeks into the construction with a team of 3 people Walter hadn't met before, 2 women and a man, all in their 30s, all with the alert and focused quality that Ethan seemed to select for in the people around him. They set up at the folding tables in the cleared section of the garage that Dylan's crew had designated as the temporary classroom space, and they spent the whole day with Walter going through the records, not reading them. Walter had already gone through them himself and organized them into categories that he and Ethan had sketched out during their 2-hour curriculum conversation. What this team did was something more systematic. They photographed every record. They transcribed the handwritten text. They cross-referenced entries across decades, pulling out patterns that Walter had known were there, but had never assembled into explicit form. The first pattern they identified was the one Walter had always called the sequence of honest questions. When a bike came in presenting a problem, Walter's records showed that he never started with the presenting symptom. He started 3 steps back. What was the last change made to this machine? What were the conditions when the problem appeared? What had the owner assumed was wrong, and what in the record contradicted that assumption? The answer to the actual problem in 40% of the cases documented was different from what the owner had believed, and finding the real problem required ignoring the stated problem long enough to understand the bike's history. One of Ethan's team members, a woman named Priya who had a background in industrial education, sat back in her chair after an hour of this and said, "He's been teaching diagnostic epistemology for 38 years. In English," Walter said from across the room. Priya looked at him. "Sorry, it means the study of how we know what we know, how we arrive at correct conclusions. You've developed a systematic method for questioning assumptions before acting on them, and you've been applying it to mechanical diagnosis consistently for almost 4 decades. That's not just craft knowledge, that's a philosophy of knowing." Walter considered this. "I thought of it as not jumping to conclusions," he said. "That's what epistemology is," Priya said. "You were just applying it with your hands." Walter looked at the record she'd been examining, a 2001 Kawasaki ZX6R, September of 2004. Owner convinced the carburetors were the problem. Actual problem, a hairline crack in the airbox that had altered the fuel-air mixture under specific RPM conditions. He had found it in 40 minutes because he had refused to believe the obvious answer. "My father," Walter said for the second time in 2 weeks, "said the land tells the truth if you stop talking long enough to hear it." Priya wrote it down. "First lesson," she said, same as Ethan said. The curriculum took shape over the next 10 days in a way that Walter found simultaneously surprising and entirely logical. The way a good repair revealed a structure that had always been there waiting for the right attention to make it visible. He had never thought of himself as a teacher. He had taught his son. He had over the years answered questions from younger mechanics who stopped by with problems they couldn't solve. But systematic teaching, structured, sequential design to move a person from not knowing to knowing, that was different, and he had not been sure he could do it. What Ethan's team showed him was that he already had done it. The records were the curriculum already written. The sequence of entries in the oldest cabinet from 1986 through the early 90s documented a mechanic learning by doing, making mistakes, noting them, adjusting. The sequence in the middle cabinets showed the methodology maturing, the diagnostic approach becoming more systematic, the notes becoming more precise. The recent records showed a master not because the problems got easier, but because the thinking got cleaner. "Your records," Priya told him one afternoon, "are the most complete documentation of a craft learning process I have ever seen. You didn't just document what you did, you documented why you did it, what you were thinking, what you tried first, and why it didn't work. That's rare. Most craftspeople can tell you what they do. They can't tell you why because the why has become instinct. You kept the why on paper." Walter thought about the night 30 years ago when he had started adding the reasoning column to his records. He had done it because he had made a mistake on a Honda CB that cost him 6 hours he didn't have, and he had not wanted to make the same mistake again, and he had realized that writing down the repair wasn't enough. He needed to write down the thinking behind it so he could examine it later and find where it had gone wrong. "I did it because I made a mistake," he said. Most good teaching methods come from someone making a mistake and refusing to repeat it, Priya said. That's how knowledge becomes transmissible. He had never thought about it that way. He was starting to think about a lot of things in ways he hadn't before. The first application for the Heritage Center program arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks before the planned opening. Sandra forwarded it to Walter's email. He had an email address. He simply used it rarely with a note that said, "We haven't officially opened applications yet. This came through the website contact form. I thought you should see it first." The application was from a man named Jerome Whitfield, 28 years old, Army veteran, 2 tours in Afghanistan, had been working as a parts counter employee at a dealership in Billings for 3 years. His statement of interest was 1 paragraph long, and Walter read it 3 times. I grew up watching my grandfather work on engines in his garage in Georgia. He passed away when I was 14 and the garage got sold. I joined the Army because I needed structure, and I found it. I came home with skills that don't translate anywhere useful. I've been working parts counters, and I'm grateful for the work, but I'm watching knowledge disappear around me. Older mechanics retiring, nobody learning what they knew, and I feel like I missed something I was supposed to learn. I want to learn it before it's completely gone. I want to be someone who can teach it someday the way my grandfather would have taught me if he'd had the time. Walter read it a 4th time. He thought about a 14-year-old boy watching a garage get sold that carried everything his grandfather had known. He thought about Ryan. He typed back slowly because he was not a fast typist and had no intention of becoming one. A reply that said, "Jerome, your application is noted and you will receive a formal response through the program's official process. But I wanted to write to you directly to tell you that what you described, the knowledge disappearing, the feeling of having missed something, that is exactly what this program exists for. Keep your contact information current. We'll be in touch." He sent it before he could think too hard about whether it was appropriate to contact an applicant directly. Sandra called him 20 minutes later. "Walter," she said, "you can't individually contact applicants before the selection process." "I know," he said. "I did it anyway." A pause. "You're going to be a very unconventional educational director." "I was a mechanic for 38 years, Walter said. "I solved problems the way they needed to be solved, not the way the manual said to. That's not changing." Another pause. Then Sandra said something he hadn't expected. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, a genuine one. "Fair enough," she said. "I'll make a note." 3 days before the opening, Vicki Lawson called again. "We're coming," she said. Walter had been expecting this. He had not been expecting the particular way she said it, the weight in it, the significance. "All 12, he said, "all 12 plus." She paused. "Walter, word got out in the community. You might want to prepare yourself." "Prepare myself for what?" "For more than 12, she said. "That's all I'm going to say. Just be ready." Walter stood with the phone and thought about what that might mean, and found that he was not in fact able to prepare himself. Some things you couldn't anticipate your way through. You just had to open the door and see what came through it. But the night before the opening, Walter stayed late. He had done this consciously, dismissed Dylan's crew at 5 Cent. Priya and her team back to their hotel, told Ethan he'd see him in the morning. He needed the last night in the garage to be his. Just him and the tools, and the photographs, and the coffee machine, and whatever came to him in the quiet. He walked the whole building. The new sections. First, the expanded workspace, the classroom with its 12 stations arranged in a semicircle around a central demonstration area. The storage room. The updated bathrooms that Dylan had insisted on despite Walter's indifference to the subject. He walked through all of it and noted what had been built and approved of it genuinely, which was more than he had expected when this started. Then he walked back to the original space. He stood at his workbench. He ran his hand along the edge of it, the original wood, his father-in-law's lumber. Still solid, still true, worn smooth by 38 years of hands and work in the ordinary, extraordinary passage of time, doing what time does to surfaces that are used every day by someone who cares about them. He looked at the photographs. 211 faces. He had numbered them himself, small pencil marks on the backs of the frames corresponding to a catalog he'd typed up and given to Dylan. Everyone had been removed and replaced and was back exactly where it had been, exactly where Evelyn had helped him hang the first ones back when the wall was empty and the shop was new and Ryan was 7 years old and would sometimes fall asleep on the old couch in the corner during the long evening jobs. He found Ryan's, 3rd row, 7th from the left. He stood in front of it for a long time. "This is yours too," he said. "Everything that happens here from tomorrow, it's yours too. You know that." He poured a cup of coffee from the rattling machine. He drank it standing up. He looked at his hands. In the morning, the garage would have students in it for the first time. Young people and not so young people who were coming to learn what his hands knew. He had been afraid of that in the weeks of preparation, not the teaching itself, but the magnitude of the responsibility. What he knew had taken 38 years to accumulate. He was being asked to give it to people in months. It felt sometimes like being asked to compress a life into a lesson plan. But Priya had said something in one of their last sessions that had settled him. She had said, "You're not trying to give them your 38 years. You're trying to give them the foundation that makes 38 years possible. You're giving them the beginning. They'll build the rest themselves." Walter thought about his father, about the thing he had said about the land stop talking long enough to hear it. His father had given him a beginning, a way of listening. Everything else Walter had learned by doing, by failing, by writing down the failure and examining it until it became knowledge. That was how it worked. You gave someone the beginning and trusted them with the rest. He could do that. He had been doing that his whole life. He finished the coffee. He washed the cup. He turned off the lights in the new sections, all of them one by one. He left on the single work light over his original bench, the one that had been there since 1991. The one he always left on overnight because he liked knowing the bench was lit even when nobody was there. He put on his jacket. He stopped at the door. He turned around and looked at his garage, the old part and the new part, the photographs and the tools and the records in the cabinet and the coffee machine and the light over the bench, all of it together. The whole thing, what 38 years of refusing to give up looked like when you finally saw it clearly. "All right, Evelyn," he said, "tomorrow." He turned off the main light. He walked out. He did not look back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was there. And in the morning, for the first time in 38 years, other people would know too. The morning of the opening, Walter was at the garage by 6:15. Not because he had planned to be. He had planned to arrive at 7:30, a reasonable hour, a calm arrival. Nothing that looked like the anxiety it actually was. But he had woken at 5, laying in the dark for 20 minutes, telling himself he was going back to sleep, and then gotten up and made coffee and stood in his kitchen and understood that he was not going to be able to be anywhere except the garage until this day had started properly. So he drove over in the early cold and let himself in and stood in the original workspace with his first cup of the morning and let the quiet settle him. The building smelled different now. Still oil and metal and the particular dusty warmth of a working garage. Those things didn't change. And Walter was grateful they didn't. But underneath that new lumber-fresh paint, the clean smell of the new floor coating on the expanded sections. It was the smell of something that had been remade without losing what it was. Walter stood in it and breathed it and decided it was right. He walked to the bench. He straightened his tools, which didn't need straightening. He checked the coffee machine, which was fine. He looked at the photographs, all 211, everyone back in place exactly. He found Ryan without looking. 3rd row, 7th from the left. Blue helmet. That grin. "Today's the day," he said. He heard the first car at 7:45, then another. Then from down the highway, the unmistakable sound of motorcycles, not one, not two, but many, a whole collection of engines arriving together with the organized, unhurried sound of people who had ridden a long way and were nearly there. Walter walked to the door. He opened it, and what he saw stopped him completely. Vicky had said more than 12. She had said, "Be ready." He had thought she meant 15, maybe 20, an expanded group, a few extra riders who had heard about the event and wanted to come. He had not thought she meant what he was now looking at, a line of motorcycles stretching down the highway, as far as he could see in the morning light, all of them coming toward his lot, all of them slowing and turning in one after another, filling the newly paved, expanded parking area that Dylan had built and that Walter had thought was perhaps excessive. It was not excessive. He stood in his doorway and counted. He stopped counting at 60. Vicky pulled up first. She parked and climbed off and walked to him with the same directness she'd shown in the rain 11 weeks ago, and she looked at his face and said, "I told you to be ready." "You said more than 12, Walter said. His voice came out slightly different than he intended. "I thought you meant..." "Word travels," Vicky said. "In the writing community, a story like yours, what you did that night, what happened after word travels fast and far. There are people here from Wyoming, Idaho, 2 riders from Oregon who drove 2 days." She paused. "There are people here who never met you. They came because of what you represent." Walter looked out at the lot, still filling, still more engines on the highway. "What do I represent?" he asked. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. He truly wanted to know. Vicky looked at him steadily. "The fact that it's still possible," she said. "That a person can live with integrity, do the right thing, hold on to what matters, refuse to compromise on the essential things and not lose. that it's still possible to not lose. Walter stood with that. I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. She had named the thing he hadn't been able to name himself, and now it was named, and it was both smaller and larger than he'd expected. Smaller because it was simple, larger because it was true. Come inside, he said finally. The coffee machine is on. The formal opening was scheduled for 10 o'clock and started at 10 o'clock because Sandra Okafor ran things that started on time. Charles Whitmore had flown in the night before and was standing with Ethan near the entrance to the new section when Walter came through from the original workspace, and the two of them looked at the crowd filling the building and the parking area and overflowing onto the sidewalk in front, and Charles caught Walter's eye and said simply, "You did this." "I opened a door in a storm," Walter said. "That's how all of it starts," Charles said. "Every single good thing, someone opens a door." The program was short because Walter had insisted on it. He had told Sandra people didn't come here to watch speeches. They came to see the garage and meet the students and understand what was going to happen here. So there were 3 speakers and no one spoke for more than 4 minutes. Charles went first, then Ethan, then Walter. He had not written anything down. He had tried the night before at his kitchen table and had written 3 sentences and crossed them out and written 2 more and decided the whole exercise was wrong. He didn't write speeches. He talked to people. That was different. So he stood in front of the crowd, which had become somehow over 100 people packed into and around his garage, spilling back through the new sections, and he looked at them and he talked the way he always talked. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "That's the whole thing. That's the whole description. I fix machines that are broken and I send them away working, and I've done that for 38 years in this building, and I plan to do it for however many years I have left." He paused. "What this place is going to do starting this week is make more mechanics. Not the kind who wait for a computer to give them the answer. The kind who listen to the machine and trust what it tells them. The kind who write down what they learn so the next person doesn't have to figure it out from scratch." Another pause. "My wife told me 38 years ago that a person doesn't need to have everything to give something. She was right. She was right about most things. All of this is proof that she was right." He stopped. He looked at the crowd. "That's all I've got," he said. "The coffee machine is in the corner. Help yourself. Don't touch the pegboard." The laughter that came back at him was warm and real and surprised him more than he expected. He stepped back and Sandra stepped forward, and the formal part was over and the actual part began. The first cohort of students had been selected from 231 applications that had come in during the 6 weeks between Jerome Whitfield's message and the closing of the application window. 12 students as specified in the partnership agreement. Walter had been involved in the selection and had argued for 3 additional spots and lost the argument with Sandra, who had said the logistics of the first cohort needed to be manageable, and 12 was manageable and 15 was not. He had accepted this. He had been in businesses long enough to know which arguments to have and which ones to let go. Jerome Whitfield was one of the 12. He was standing near the original workbench when Walter found him standing at a respectful distance, not touching anything, looking at the tools with an expression Walter recognized immediately because he had felt it himself at 14, the first time his own father had taken him into a working garage and let him understand that machines had a logic you could learn. "Jerome," Walter said. Jerome turned. He was taller than Walter had expected from the application, 6'2" broad, with the upright posture of someone who had spent years in the military and the slightly careful way of moving that sometimes came with it. He was 28 years old, and he looked both younger and older than that simultaneously, which Walter had noticed was common in veterans young, in the eyes old somewhere underneath. "Mr. Hayes," Jerome said. He put out his hand. Walter shook it. "You drove from Billings." "Last night, stayed at the motel on Route 12. He looked around the garage. "This place is exactly what your email sounded like." "What did my email sound like?" Jerome thought about it. "Like someone who wasn't trying to impress anyone." Walter looked at him. "Good," he said. "That's right." Jerome's eyes went back to the tools, to the pegboard, to the modified ones that didn't look like anything in any catalog. "Can I ask about one of these?" Jerome said. "The one with the bent housing on the left side second row from the top." Walter looked at the tool. "That's a modified valve spring compressor. The original housing was straight, and it couldn't reach the valve spring on certain older Japanese inline fours, without removing the intake manifold first. I bent the housing 17 degrees in 1998, and it's been doing the job ever since without the manifold coming off. Jerome stared at it. You just bent it. The material allowed it. The geometry worked. The problem was solved. Walter paused. That's lesson one. Jerome looked at him. What is when the existing tool doesn't fit the problem, you don't abandon the problem. You fix the tool. Walter held his gaze. Write that down. Jerome didn't have anything to write on. He looked around, slightly at a loss. Walter opened the drawer under the bench and pulled out a small notebook, one of the plain ones he bought in bulk at the office supply store in the next town over, and a pen. Here, he said. Jerome took them. He wrote it down. He looked at what he'd written. Then he looked back at the modified compressor. My grandfather had things like this, he said quietly. Tools he'd changed. I didn't know what I was looking at when I was a kid. I just thought they looked different. They looked different because he made them work better, Walter said. Your grandfather was doing the same thing. Jerome was quiet for a moment. I wish I'd known that then. You know it now, Walter said. That's what matters. You know it now and you're here. Jerome nodded. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, not the way things shift in movies, but the small, real way that happens when a person settles into something and stops being afraid of it. Yes, sir, he said. Walter left him there and moved through the crowd. He talked to each of the other 11 students in the first cohort. A woman named Carmen Reyes, 34, from New Mexico, who had been trying to find someone to teach her traditional carb tuning for 2 years and had been told repeatedly that it wasn't a skill worth learning in the age of fuel injection. A man named David Park, no relation to Howard, who was 19 years old and had driven up from Wyoming with a single bag and a letter from his high school shop teacher that said simply, this boy understands machines the way some people understand language. Let him in. A 62-year-old retired firefighter named Gary Kowalski, who said he had fixed motorcycles as a hobby for 30 years and was running out of problems he could solve on his own and needed someone to teach him what he didn't know. Walter talked to every one of them. He shook every hand. He looked at every face. What he saw in 12 different people was the same thing. A version of the thing Jerome had shown him at the workbench. A person who had arrived somewhere they had been trying to get to for a long time and who was not yet fully sure they were allowed to be here. Whose whole posture was the physical expression of hoping the door wasn't going to close before they got through it. Walter knew that feeling. He made a point with each one of saying something specific. Not a welcome speech, not a generic encouragement, but something particular to them. Something that showed he had read their application, understood their story, knew who they were before they walked in. He had learned this from Evelyn, who had been the kind of person who remembered what you told her and used that memory as a way of saying you matter specifically, not just generally. By noon, the formal opening had dissolved into something more organic. People talking, eating food that Pete Durnan had organized from the diner 2 blocks over. Without being asked, wandering through the new sections of the garage clustered around the original workspace, asking Ethan and Priya questions. Charles was in a corner talking to a group of older riders who had recognized him, and Walter could see from across the room that Charles was doing what Charles always did, listening more than talking, asking questions instead of providing answers. Vicky found Walter at 12:30, standing at the edge of the crowd near the original bench with a coffee cup in his hand and the particular expression of a man who is inside a significant moment and is trying to experience it fully rather than just survive it. You okay? She said. I'm trying to figure that out, Walter said. What does it feel like? He thought about it. He was always honest about what things felt like when someone asked directly and meant it. It feels like something I built but didn't plan, he said. Like the difference between designing a structure and finding one that was always there. I didn't build this. He gestured at the room. I just kept showing up. And this turned out to be what showing up looked like eventually. Vicky was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked at the photographs. She had looked at them every time she'd been here. At the opening, she'd brought 3 other members over to the wall and told them to look, just look, and they had. I counted once, she said, at 211. 212, Walter said. As of this morning. Vicky turned to look at him. You added one? Dylan took it before they left last week. Walter looked at the wall at the newest photograph, the crew and Walter and Ethan and Sandra and Charles standing in the finished garage, the original bench visible behind them. I figured the people who rebuilt the place belonged on the wall with everybody else. Vicky stared at the photograph for a moment. Where is it? Bottom row, far right. Last one. She found it. She looked at it. That's right, she said softly. That's exactly right. The crowd began to thin around 2 in the afternoon, and by 3 it was down to the students, the staff and the core group, Charles and Ethan, and Sandra, Vicky, and Marcus, whose shoulder had healed well, and Pete Dernan, who had no official role and was not going anywhere. It was Marcus who brought it up. I was sitting on the stool by the original bench, the same stool he had sat on 11 weeks ago while Walter improvised a sling for his shoulder, and he looked at the wall of photographs and then at Walter and said, "My shoulder still is what you did for it." Walter looked at him. It healed properly. Full mobility. Doctor said I'd never know it happened. He paused. He also said whoever put the sling on knew what they were doing. I drove an ambulance for 2 years in the 80s, Walter said. Ethan told me. Marcus had the quality of a man who chose his words slowly and meant all of them. I wanted to say thank you. Properly. I didn't do it right when we left. You were in pain, Walter said. You said enough. I want to say it now, Marcus said, without the pain so I can mean it the way I mean it. He looked at Walter directly. Thank you. For the shoulder and for the door and for not being the kind of person who does math on other people before deciding if they're worth helping. Walter looked at him for a moment. Your club has a name for what some people think of you, Walter said carefully. Marcus smiled, not a polished smile, a real one. Yeah. I grew up in Montana, Walter said. I've known hard men my whole life. My father was one. My best friend in the Army. I did 2 years in the 60s before the garage. Not a lot of people know that was one. Hard men aren't the problem. Men who gave up on themselves are the problem. Those aren't the same thing. Marcus was very still. No, he said. They're not. They looked at each other for a moment the way men look at each other when something real has been exchanged. Then Walter said, "How's the bike running?" Marcus laughed. It was an unexpected sound, full and genuine, and it changed the whole character of the room. Perfect, he said. Hasn't sounded that good in 2 years. Bring it back in 6 months and I'll check the... I know, Marcus said. I will. The twist came at 4 o'clock when almost everyone was gone. Walter was in the original workspace, finally alone with a cup of coffee and the particular satisfaction of a day that had been exactly as hard and as good as it needed to be when Charles came in and sat on the stool across from him and put both hands flat on the bench the way Walter did when he had something to work through. Walter waited. I need to tell you something, Charles said. Something I should have told you before today, but that I kept finding reasons to delay. Walter looked at him. The tone in Charles's voice was different from anything he had heard from him before, not uncertain. Charles Whitmore was not uncertain in any way Walter had observed, but careful. Careful in the way of someone approaching something that matters and doesn't want to handle it wrong. Tell me, Walter said. Charles was quiet for a moment. Then I knew Ryan. Walter's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down. Not well, Charles continued quickly, not defensively, just accurately. We met once, at a rally in Colorado the spring before his accident. He came up to me at a booth we were running. He was interested in some of the engine work we were displaying. He had questions about vintage transmission design, really good questions, the kind that told you immediately that this wasn't casual interest, but deep knowledge. Charles paused. We talked for about an hour. I gave him my card. He never called. Walter was not breathing correctly. He was aware of this and was managing it. He died that October, Walter said. I know. Charles met his eyes. I didn't connect it until Ethan mentioned your name and your son when he was briefing me before my visit. Walter Hayes, Red Hollow, Montana, son named Ryan, who died in Colorado. I looked it up to be sure. He paused. The rally was in March. He died in October. 7 months. Ryan had carried Charles Whitmore's card for 7 months without calling. Walter understood that. He understood it completely because he recognized the instinct, the card you hold on to because what it represents feels too large to reach toward until you're ready. And by the time you're ready, something has changed and the window is closed. He had almost done the same thing himself. I was planning to call, Walter said. It was not a question, it was the thing he knew about his son. I believe he was, Charles said. The questions he asked, he was thinking about something bigger than his current situation. He was thinking about where he was going. Walter sat with this. He sat with it the way you sit with something that is both terrible and necessary. The particular grief of a thing that almost happened and didn't, that had always been the hardest kind because it had no resolution, no way to settle. Ryan had been an hour away from something. An hour of conversation, a card in his pocket, a plan he hadn't made yet. And then October in a mountain road in Colorado, and none of it. Why are you telling me this now, Walter said. His voice was steady. He was making it steady. Because I should have told you before today, Charles said. Because you deserve to know. And because he stopped, restarted. Because what we built here today, the Heritage Center, the students, all of it. I want you to know that it is partly for Ryan, not in a way I planned. I didn't plan this when I found out, but it became true anyway the way some things do. He looked at Walter directly. Your son wanted to know what you know. He was on his way to finding people who could teach him. He never got there. But the people who are going to sit at those 12 stations, they're going to learn what he would have learned, and that feels like something worth knowing. Walter looked at his hands on the bench. He thought about Ryan at the rally asking good questions, carrying a card home in his jacket, planning a call he never made. He thought about the space between what happens and what almost happens, and how thin that line is, and how much weight it carries. He thought about Jerome Whitfield, 28 years old, who had watched his grandfather's garage get sold when he was 14 and had spent 14 years trying to find his way back to it. I thought about Carmen Reyes, who had been told for 2 years that what she wanted to learn wasn't worth learning. He thought about David Park, 19 years old, who understood machines the way some people understood language. They were Ryan's age, or close to it. They were exactly who Ryan had been, people with the right instincts and the wrong timing, people trying to find the door before it closed. It is something, Walter said finally. It's a lot of something. Charles nodded. He put his hand on the bench between them, not on Walter's hand, not a theatrical gesture, just his hand on the bench close. They sat there for a moment. The garage around them was quiet. The construction smell had almost faded now. The coffee machine rattled in the corner. The photographs looked down from the east wall, 212 faces, every one of them, a person who had brought something broken here and left with it whole. All right, Walter said. All right, Charles said. They both reached for their coffee at the same time, and neither of them mentioned it, and that was enough. Classes began the following Monday at 8 in the morning. Walter was at the bench at 7. He had laid out the tools in the sequence he had decided on, not by type, not by size, but by the order of understanding. The tools you used when you listened first. Then the tools you used when you knew what you were hearing. Then the tools you used when you were sure. The 12 students filed in at 7:55. They sat at their stations in the semicircle. They looked at Walter. Walter looked at them. Jerome had his notebook open already. Carmen had a pen behind her ear. David Park was sitting very straight, the way young people sit when they're trying to show they're ready without knowing yet what ready looks like from the inside. Gary Kowalski, 62 years old, former firefighter, had the settled stillness of a man who had waited a long time for this and was not going to waste a second of it now that it was here. Walter picked up a tool from his bench. The modified valve spring compressor, the one with the 17-degree bend he'd made in 1998 to reach where the original couldn't. He held it up. This was a tool that didn't work, he said. It didn't fit the problem. Most people would have found a different approach or accepted a longer job or looked in a catalog for something better. He turned it in his hand. I bent it 17 degrees and it fit. The machine got fixed. The knowledge of why I bent it went into a record that night, and that record is in the cabinet over there, and it's been in there for 26 years. He lowered the tool. You are here to learn how to bend the tool, not the physical act, the thinking behind it, the refusal to accept that the problem can't be solved just because the existing solution doesn't fit. That's what I'm going to teach you. Everything else is just application. Nobody moved. He looked at them. My wife used to say that a person doesn't need to have everything to give something, he said. I've been saying that to people for months now, and I'm going to keep saying it because it's the truest thing I know. You don't have 38 years of knowledge. You don't have the right tools yet. You don't have the experience. You have almost nothing in the technical sense. He paused. But you have the thing that matters most. You showed up. You came through the door. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. Everything else can be taught. The showing up that has to come from inside you, and every one of you already proved you have it. Jerome was writing, Carmen was writing, David Park was writing with the slightly desperate speed of someone who doesn't want to miss a word. Gary Kowalski was not writing. He was looking at Walter with the expression of a man who has found the place he was supposed to be and is taking a moment to understand that he has actually arrived. Walter looked at Gary. Gary nodded once. Walter nodded back. "All right," Walter said, "let's get to work." 1 year later to the day the motorcycles came back. Walter heard them from inside the garage, the same sound he had heard 11 weeks into a night that had changed everything but larger now and expected and carrying something different in it. He set down his tools. He told Jerome, who was now in his second cohort and had stayed on as a teaching assistant, which had not been planned but had been obviously correct, to hold the class for 10 minutes. He walked to the door. The parking area was filling fast. Not just the original 12, Vicky had said it the week before on the phone. Word keeps traveling, Walter. People are coming from places I didn't even reach out to. He had believed her this time. He had been ready. He watched them come in. Riders he recognized and riders he had never seen. Some of them had driven 2 days. Some of them had driven 2 hours. Some of them had come because they had heard the story and wanted to see the place with their own eyes. Some of them, he suspected, had come because they needed to see that the place still existed, that it had not been a story that ended the way stories like this sometimes ended, with the good thing undone by the reality of the world. It was still here. He was still here. The garage was still his in every way that mattered. Vicky got off her bike and walked to him. She looked at his face and he looked at hers, and she said, "You didn't think it would be like this." "No," he said, "I didn't." "What did you think it would be?" "Smaller," he said. "I thought it would be smaller." She shook her head. "Kindness doesn't stay small," she said. "It never did. You of all people should know that." Walter looked at the parking area. He looked at the people. He looked at his garage, the original part and the expanded part, the photographs and the tools and the light over the bench that had never gone off, and he felt fully and without qualification the thing he had been working toward for 38 years without knowing what to call it. Not success, not security, not even happiness exactly. Completion. The specific and irreplaceable feeling of a thing that was always supposed to be a certain way finally becoming that thing. Of a life that had aimed at something even when the aim felt uncertain, or arriving at its mark. Marcus came up beside him, shoulder-heeled, both hands, working that real, full laugh already ready somewhere in his chest. "Same time next year," Marcus said. "Same time every year," Walter said. He looked out at all of them, 130 people in his parking lot, more arriving the highway briefly alive with the sound of engines, and he knew that this was not the end of anything. This was the thing that kept going. The door he had opened in a storm had not closed behind him. It had stayed open, and other people had walked through it, and they had opened doors of their own, and now there were doors open everywhere that had started from one man deciding at 11 o'clock at night, in the worst storm in 40 years, that he still had something to give. A person doesn't need to have everything to give something. He never did. He never would. That was the lesson. That was always the lesson. And now there were 12 students in a semicircle inside his garage who were learning it, and 12 more who would come after them, and 12 more after that, carrying forward what his hands knew and what his records held and what his wife had known all along and told him plainly on the night he opened his first door, that the giving was the point, that it had always been the point, and that the only question that ever truly mattered was whether, when the moment came and everything was against you and the rain was coming down hard and 12 strangers were standing in the dark outside your door, you had enough left inside you to say yes. Walter Hayes had said yes, and the world in its slow and imperfect and occasionally magnificent way had said yes back.